remember, keep in mind, remember to keep in mind that this will be available on Canvas at the end of class, so keep that in mind, okay? So again, I have just my hand here, and then I have a hand with a glove on. I'm going to use both to see in terms of what happens when we use different sort of amounts of pressure and different amounts of mark making that we can use for our actual still life, okay? So in terms of materiality, again, I have my charcoal, which I have here. I'm just going to lay it down here. This is my vine. Here is my white compressed. Here is my kneaded eraser. Now you'll remember your eraser in your supply kits should look like a square, a gray square. This is just sort of an older kneaded eraser that I'm going to be using. And what you want to do is start to mold in and start to kind of finick and kind of stretch out some of those bits and pieces the more and more we start to use it. And it's almost sort of a rubbery material, almost feels like rubber, direct and Play-Doh, as well as my white eraser. Obviously this white eraser is really, it's used up. So those of you who have your new eraser, it should be new and just ready to go. I do also have some blue painter's tape. What I have done is sort of divide a horizontal composition here, because I'm going to start with my value first, and then I'm actually going to move on to the next page and start the still life directly. So what I'm going to do is take off, maybe 1 second. To find more of my, and I also have my compressed black, and then I'm going to find a little bit more of my vine. Okay. What I like to do is sort of break some of my pieces so I have enough sort of collection to kind of work with. So I'm going to make 2 value scales, one sort of from left to right, and then another one here from left to right, because we'll start to see this process and see what happens when it reacts to some of the amount of pressure. But what I also want to do is sort of, I have some paper towel that I like to sort of keep on hand, because again, this is a dirty process. We will sort of find a lot of messy encounters within the idea of this still life, but I really want you to start to look at this process is within the ways in which that we will encounter a lot of mistakes. We will start to look at the ways and see how some of the materials will start to shift and change within the making, okay? So everybody can see what I see, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah. If anybody doesn't, just please let me know. And then you could also provide that on the chat. And I'll try to keep in mind to kind of monitor the chat room. If I don't monitor the chat room, just let me know. Feel free to speak, or if somebody else wants to speak on somebody else's behalf, by all means, okay? Again, I have this sort of, my phone sort of attached to the stand, or the sort of metal sort of arm that holds the lens of my actual camera, so I can start to zoom in and out, so I can be able to have sort of the luxury to work with different angles. But what I've done is sort of use one sheet of my Strathmore, and what I'm going to do is start just applying a little bit of pressure with my vine. And those of you who want to follow along in this process, you by all means do so, okay? Because then you can actually ask me some questions or concerns that you have on your end. If you're worried about some of the ways in which the materials are not working, or if you're encountering other sort of dilemmas or situations, this is a great time to ask those questions within the making, okay? So what I'm gonna do is make just like sort of a very, very light mark. I'm just gonna move my camera slightly more to the left, okay? And I'm actually gonna just start off from here and just make a sort of small swatch with a medium amount of pressure. What I mean by that is this, I'm adding a little bit more. And you can start to see, I'm just zoom in slightly. That's better so you can see it more. The material itself is extremely sort of freehand, meaning that it almost looks like dust once I add a little bit more pressure. But if I lightly graze my hand, just slightly, and this is a sort of a lighter amount of pressure, you could see how dramatically different those values are. But if I take my hand, and this is sort of my hand without the glove, and if I apply a little bit of pressure and kind of like almost massage it into my sheet of paper to sort of get a nice consistent even square and this sort of consistent value, you can see how that looks on your end if you're following along. But when you do the same thing here, and I'm kind of going in circular motions, and then more sort of up and down, you can see what happens there in terms of the sort of the ways in which that sort of light almost molds into a lighter gray. Now, if I start adding a little bit more lighter marks, and this is really, really light, just scribbling this in there. Actually, I've added a little bit more pressure. And I'm going to shift from my index to my middle and kind of blend this in here. You can see it almost disappears. But within the ways in which you can look at your value, I want you to put this into practice and do this on your sheets of paper, because it's really within the amount of pressure that we apply. So you can start to see what happens within some of those darks and lights, okay? That was my vine, okay? I'll actually label this V, okay? Now let's move slightly to the right. I'm going to leave a little bit of the line so you guys can see. I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm actually going to add a little bit more pressure, not more pressure, excuse me. I'm going to change my material to my compressed. Okay. Now the compressed is the one that's shaped as almost like a square. So if that makes sense, okay? Those of you who want to separate those materials. And you can feel that it's a little bit harder. Okay, it's a little bit more bolder and it's a lot darker. So if I start to blend some of these areas together, you can kind of get a nice sort of rich, almost a sort of black. And I do apologize if I'm shaking my camera too much. Okay, let's shift it a little bit this way so you can see it. I just don't want that shadow of the phone to see, because I apologize. So it's a little bit hard to see. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the next one. Give me 1 second. I'm actually going to use the side of my compressed. Okay. And again, since my index and middle are sort of dirty, I'm going to use my ring finger. Now you can use the same finger, obviously, but I like to sort of separate them because I want to see what happens when those sort of different amounts. Okay. And that's sort of a middle tone of my compress. And now let's go to the light. Remember, a little bit goes a long way. Okay. I'm actually go back to I'm actually going to use my glove, see what happens. Now it's a little bit interesting in terms of texture. My paper is moving. but it does get a little bit harder when you use a glove. Let me zoom out a little bit. But then now you can see how they look. I'm actually gonna take my glove off and start using my other hand. And actually blends a little bit better. Do we have any questions about this so far? You can see, this is.
I wanted to ask, is it not advised to like blow on it?
You can. Who's speaking, by the way? I can't. I don't know who's speaking.
Sophia, sorry.
No, you're good, Sophia. Thank you. If you did blow on it, Sophia, just keep in mind some of those particles of the vine or the compress may actually be sort of spread out through your drawing and on your floor. It could get on your shirt, on your clothing, on your carpet. It's sort of again, dirty process, but I want you to just to remember that if you have an area within your space to kind of have enough within the environment of making a mess, right? Just know that those, if you do blow on it, it will go everywhere. But I mean, it's not going to be that noticeable, but once like, if I start blowing on it, I can see some of those particles left off of there and I don't know where they went. I just, it's really up to you if you don't mind it throughout your, throughout your home or throughout your space. By all means, obviously I don't mind, but those of you who want to keep sort of clean station at home, know that you have enough space to make a mess. Did that make sense, Sophia?
Yeah, thank you.
You're
It's
welcome.
also not gonna ruin the drawing. It's like
No. It won't. No, absolutely not. But this will be a dirty process. Sometimes the dirtier the drawing, maybe it could be the better, right? Because let's actually put that into practice. Let's say, for example, if this was our drawing at this stage, Sophia. If I take my kneaded eraser and I'm starting to mold this, so I'll do it slowly so you guys can see. Okay. And if I start to erase some of these areas, I'm just making a line.
Oh, wow.
You can see that vine came off very nicely. I'm not applying like barely any amount of pressure, but if I did that to my compressed, and you can see these darker marks, that's where all that vine was sucked up. It almost looks like a vacuum, or it works like a vacuum, the kneaded eraser. The ways in which we use it is sort of molded again. So the lighter marks of these areas, especially here, we could use for our compressed. Same amount of pressure, but notice the difference,
Okay.
how much it took off, right? Now, if I use my white eraser on my compressed, it comes off more, but there's still residue. You can still see what was beneath that drawing, what we made before. So part of the process within this work, guys, is just to remember the fact that we really want to start off with our vine first, because once we erase with our kneaded or white eraser, it actually becomes much more easier to see our sheets of Strathmore much more clearly. So if we make a mistake, if we make a mark, we make a value that was sort of an area that we didn't intentionally want to leave on our drawings, we could erase it. But I want you to start with the vine first before we get into the compressed, because the compressed is extremely difficult to erase. You can see within the ways in which some of the erasing marks are. But it really depends on your objects. But maybe that also can have an interesting effect between some of the lighter shadows or some of the areas within the drawing. You can keep really, really light and dark. So that's really up to you. But within the process, I really want you to also to understand how you can start to see your work. within the reference or within the arrangement of the objects. But let's put this into practice. Let me start off the next sheet of paper. Any questions about this? Again, this is going to be a dirty process. Notice my hand is pretty dirty. I can wash it, or I can just sort of move on. I'm going to move on just for the sake of time. I don't mind the messiness, but I'm going to sort of zoom out. And just bear with me. Let me just arrange this camera. And again, guys, I do apologize for the quality. It's not the best, but hopefully by the end of the live demo, try to upload it as a high definition resolution so you can have more, a better quality to look at this. Now, even at this stage, like even going back to Sophia, your comment earlier, if I take a paper towel and I accidentally smear it, it will start to like make a mess, right? It will come up, but then how you protect your drawing is that you could put some newsprint or just another Strathmore sheet of paper directly on top of it and sort of tape the edge so it doesn't move, just so it doesn't sort of get all over your Strathmore packs of paper. But for the sake of the demo, I'm just going to move to the next sheet, and then let me flip my sheet of paper. Questions about this so far? Okay. Again, I do have another sheet of paper ready to go. I sort of taped out, here you go, there's some better perspective. This is my entire sheet of paper, right? My Strathmore 18 by 24 inch. What I did is sort of taped out with my blue painter's tape some of the edges. This is a sort of a roughly 2-inch border, a 1.5, 2-inch border around my sheet of paper, okay? Now what I like to do is sort of zoom in slightly. I can have enough of my picture plane recorded, and that's pretty good at that area. And then let me also just, I'm gonna do a quick rinse on my hands so I can pull up my screen. Okay. Obviously, sometimes the charcoal's still there, but I mean, there's also, I just want to keep in mind, I don't want to eat with these hands. I do want to try to get enough of the charcoal off my hand, but it's not going to affect you. You know, worst comes to worst if anything happens, but I just want you to sort of keep this in mind. Charcoal is not harmful, but obviously I don't want you guys to be consuming it accidentally. Let's say if you got some in your food, or if you're in your on your clothes, it is possible to take it off, but just try to do it as quickly as possible, just so it doesn't set. So let me pull up my reference. Again, keep in mind, I will be using, the image available on Canvas. So if you want to use this as well, by all means. I'm actually going to pull it up right now just in case so we can see it. This will be the still life image I will be using. Okay. Those of you who want to follow along and do the same still life, you're more than happy to. But obviously you're not required. So keep this in mind. Okay. Ideally, it's going to be utilizing your own still life with your own sort of collection. But for the sake of the demo, if you want to follow along, you're more than happy to do that. Okay. Just bear with me. So I'm going to just sort of lightly just start off with my vine charcoal. Again, sort of mapping out where my composition is. But for the sake of time, I'm actually going to utilize just sort of a brief composition of the potted plant on the left, the stag decanter, the little candle, and then the muddler, with a little bit of that eucalyptus in the background. Okay. So again, I'm going to think really, really loosely in this process. I'm not worrying about the details. I'm not worrying about refining anything at this stage. I want to make my mistakes in this stage, in the beginning in this process. You want to start with your vine, ideally. You do not want to start work with your compressed. And later when we get into our lights, we're going to use our white compressed, okay? So I like to think really, really freely in this process. Have your wrist really, really loose and kind of work with a kind of a general sort of shape within some of these compositions. And I just sort of like to think about it like, okay, so if this is my top of my plant, which is right about here, I'm just sort of making lines to say, okay, that's how big it is, right? And this is how tall my candle will be, right about there. This is how tall my stag decanter will be, right about here. This is that sort of muddler, which is like almost in this sort of composition. It's sort of receding into that perspective, which is right about there. And then I also have that sort of piece of glass, that little goblet on the bottom, which is right about here, okay? Really, really rough, okay? Extremely difficult to see at this stage, but this is the point, because I can now start to think about, for example, oh, how wide is that plant? For example, if that plant that's holding the snakes, the snake plant, around, let's say, this big, right? Or roughly, I can go back and let's say, for example, if it's too wide, too tall, I could erase and it'll come up. Okay? But then if I want to sort of refine it, do the same thing. Just think about it really loosely. I'm just lightly kind of hovering my vine charcoal over there, okay? And you see some of these lines that come up on some of the compositions point of view. That's not a problem. So I want you to kind of leave some of the marks, because you'll start to see when we go back and add a little bit more pressure, sort of refine some of those details, it's going to be a lot easier to erase, because part of that process is really finding where you made these mistakes and then correcting them within the making, okay? So for example, here is my candle, almost sort of this scale. It almost arches this way. Notice I'm just making multiple marks, right? This is my decanter. And I notice it's obviously not a square, but it's slightly in sort of a composition of a square. There's that composition and that sort of perspective here. And this is the stag's head. Again, the stag, I'm not worrying about those details at all. What I'm doing is really looking at all the ways in which I can start to see. You can start to see some of those areas in terms of how tall the stag head is in relationship to the bottom of this area of the candle. And then that muddler, which is right around here, I'm going to also refine within this sort of perspective to see how that sort of recedes in that composition. And the goblet on the bottom, I notice it's slightly more. Notice I made that mark earlier. I need to actually change the position. Okay, because I actually need to change it more to the right, which is actually right around, it's actually not even on my picture plane, because in the bottom of my decanter right about here, that's sort of where the end of my picture plane will be. So if I sort of slightly raise my camera, you can start to see at that edge of where that tape is, you'll be able to see where my drawing sort of ends on that right side. So obviously on the bottom here, you can start to see some of the plaited fabric as the base. And I'm actually using this side of my compressed, but then I also can start to refine, hold the tip of my compressed, and I can refine some of that candle's composition. And if you use your fingers, you can actually start to blend in some of these shapes to sort of give that sort of illusion of where the shadows will be. So if my light source is coming in from my right, obviously from this side here, I'm going to make a line that goes right over the candle itself, but that also will indicate that that's where my light source will be. But then if I use the side of my vine, just to kind of fill in some of the left side of the candle, that sort of abstract mark, if you start to sort of blend in with some of your fingers, it gets this nice sort of gradient between where that value will be. But also keeping in mind, let's say, for example, if I go back to if I start to use the side of my my vine, I'm just roughly making sort of marks to see where these sort of leaves are, or these sort of stems, whatever you like to call them, because to be honest, I don't know the name of the terminology of the snake plants is leaves, but it's roughly right about there. Another one right about here. There's one over here, one over there, and there's one right over here. But notice, again, still roughly made, okay? Not worrying about any of those details. I do notice the plaid in the background as well. Now, when you're thinking about this in terms of perspective, remember your background doesn't necessarily have to be first. Those of you who wanted to work with a flatter background, you can actually keep a little bit later on within the drawing. But it's really within this sort of middle ground on this sort of stage here where all the objects are, and then towards our foreground, which is closest to us, I need to sort of keep in mind. What I also need just to remember is to kind of, when I'm working with my vine, is that I'm really looking at this space holistically, and I'm thinking about the sort of ways in which I can look at my objects in the arrangement of how I set up my still life. I'm not worrying about, again, any of the details, any of the darks and lights at this stage. I'm just trying to figure out my composition of where in which some of the arrangements are, where in which some of the objects almost speak to each other in terms of its relationship between what is larger. Obviously, my white potted plant here is the largest. Then the second largest would be the decanter, the glass decanter, and then the third would be in between the muddler and the candle, because obviously the muddler is taller, more narrow, but the candle here, it's almost in the center of the drawing itself, okay? So this is a sort of a rough idea of how we start off the drawing. Now, I'm now gonna move to my compressed, and I'm actually gonna darken some of the background to kind of showcase a variety of how much dark and light we can use within this process. Remember, I'm gonna go slightly quicker because I'm sort of short on time for 112 and 113, but I'm going to use the side of my compress and kind of work around some of my objects. And just for the sake of the demo, I'm actually going to refine some of these areas slightly later. But you can see how quickly the compress is almost dramatically different from the vine. We're going to add the eucalyptus with some of the erasing marks. Okay. But you can see how quickly that sort of compressed charcoal covers a lot of the ground within the surface of my paper, so I don't have to worry about too much. Again, I'm just using the side of my compressed to kind of look at my composition and see, okay, where are my shadows? Where are my lights? I'm actually just noticing, I'm gonna go switch back to my vine. I notice this muddler is slightly higher. So what I'm gonna do, I can actually start erasing some of this area, just the muddler, that wooden sort of dowel. And then start to see, for example, it's actually closer. So it's right about here. And again, it's sort of foreshortened, so it's slightly smaller. It gets sort of slightly smaller within that space. and go back to my compressed. I'm just gonna darken this whole thing just so we can see how it can change within that sort of space. But then also adding a light within that sort of area. Can we see this so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. But now if I'm gonna go back and start adding more pressure with my fingers. I'm using my index and my middle finger. And again, this goes back to Sophia's comment or question regarding the dust, how much dust will come off in this process, because not as much in terms of the line, but the compressed actually barely comes off on the sheet of paper. The vine is which the material actually starts to spread much more quickly. So you actually, when you put this into practice, you'll start to see what happens within the ways in which how much you use your vine. So for example, I'm going to, just for the sake of the demo, I'm going to apply more pressure, a lot more pressure on my vine, just as an example. It almost looks extremely gray, but if I take my fingers, I can start to mold in my planter. Obviously, it's not as dark because obviously the planter is almost white. You can still see that charcoal, the compressed charcoal here is slightly darker still. But then now if I use my kneaded eraser, this is where things get interesting. And I start erasing some of these areas. And again, depending on the sort of strokes in which you can kind of apply the kneaded eraser, you can get some nice values and textures in this process, but it actually takes off a lot of the vine. And this again goes back to the comment earlier of how much dust and sort of the particles leave on that surface. Here's some areas of the surface of the drawing that you can start to see come up onto that object. But then obviously you can also refine it even further. Let's say, for example, take my white eraser. And I notice actually it starts to curve. The pot starts to curve right about there. Okay, and which I obviously can't see on this side because this object's in front of it. There you go. And then, for example, if I blow on it slightly, some of those particles can come up, right? And I can actually erase the majority of these marks that we made with our vine. And actually, I like to take a sort of, not a damp, but slightly damp cloth or a rag or a paper towel, remove some of those areas. And now I have a sort of a nice composition of my pot. I could also refine it even further by using the compressed on the background. Kind of using the side of my compress, applying a little bit of pressure to kind of showcase again the drama between the contrasting colors of the lights and the darks. Did that make sense? Let me move this, sorry. Okay. Further along in this process, I also want you guys to think about how we use a light. So I'm actually going to add slightly more pressure with my compressed, but then within some of the, for example, the decanter, around the decanter itself, the stag's head, I'm just doing this really quickly, really abstractly, because I'm not worrying about any of the details yet. Going back, adding a little bit more pressure. But you can see how rich that black could be. which is fantastic because you can start to amplify the contrast and really play with the light source. But then if I go back, remember if I'm using my kneaded eraser, you can start to sort of dab in some of these areas to build upon texture, to build upon materiality. You can actually go around without even making any lines. You could actually start molding some of the objects, which will be really interesting to sort of see what happens, right? Within the sort of ways in which we can make a haze or a sort of almost a foggy composition. And darken some of the sides of the decanter. But then going back and adding more of the kneaded eraser and using the kneaded eraser as a tool, okay? And now it can start to look more similar to how all four sides of that decanter are starting to bend and curve within this arch, within this sort of line. And you can see once we use the eraser, we can actually start to mold and model some of the actual composition. And some of these areas that are starting to be slightly blurred, you could also go back and start to refine this a little bit more. Take the tip of your white eraser, start to add more highlights so it doesn't become too dark. But really you want to make these mistakes earlier with the vine because it'll be a lot easier to erase. Did this process make sense?
Yes.
Okay. But then now, it's a little bit harder to see. Now I'm going to zoom in slightly. Now this is the sort of the areas of that decanter. Hold on, let me just arrange my camera. Bear with me. Okay. If I take my white compressed, I can start adding lines, and I'm just doing this for the sake of the demo, to add highlights on top of my compressed black. So this is really interesting to use because even when you start to use your side of your white compressed, it almost has like a coolish gray tint to this color, which is interesting because you can start to see where in which some of those values can start to reflect the colors off of some of the objects. So even within the background, and it almost does look like it's sort of a chalkier sort of material, but you could also blend it in to kind of get a variation of earlier, cooler grays, which will be interesting, depending on the texture. Now, I've seen students not even use an inch of your white compress. You don't necessarily have to, but it is there to use to highlight it even further, okay? So I want you guys to use it within those supply kits, but also understand that some of the materials can actually be overworked and overdone. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Just gonna wash my hands, just bear with me.